Hi, everybody. This is Rhonda Cobb, the Money Coach, and I just know you are going to find today's show so fascinating. Joining us is Jim Rumford, and he is the author of Tobacco, Trust, and Trump: How America's Forgotten War Created Big Government. And this is such a fascinating book. I've read it. It's really good, and it's something that I don't normally read. I'm not normally a history buff, but now that I've read it, I'm like, uh-oh, we better be reading a little more history if we want our money to turn out right. Because oftentimes you'll sit back and you wonder, how in the world did our government get so big? And so Jim is going to be here to help us. But imagine Jim started out as an entrepreneur. He's also an amateur historian, and he's the CEO of the Rumford Industrial Group. He's originally from a really beautiful city called Louisville, Kentucky, but he grew up in Bracken County, and now he resides in the Dayton, Ohio area. So welcome to our show, Jim. We're so glad you could join us.
Well, thank you, Rhonda. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us what struck your interest. What made you start writing this book? Because it's so cool how it starts and how you go through things.
Well, the book started on my great-grandfather's scrapbook. And back 120 years ago, there was a thing called the Tobacco Wars that very few people even know about. And the Tobacco Wars ran from 1902 to 1908. And what happened is you had the tobacco industry was doing very well with tobacco farmers, 1870, 80, and the 1890s. So the tobacco farmers were making 5, 10, 20 cents a pound for their tobacco, as tobacco processors would come out to the farms all through the country and bid up the tobacco and buy tobacco to get their flavors and get their, smoking tobacco, chewing tobacco, pipe tobacco, whatever it was. Then a fellow by the name of Buck Duke, or better known as James Duke, he began to buy up the competition. So he produced what's called a monopoly. And it's vertical integration, where you buy your competition up and then you are a monopolist. Well, at the same time, as he became a monopolist, he was the only buyer. Then he was going to, he was then an ognopolist, which meant he was the only buyer in town. And the price went from what the prices were down to 1 or 2 cents a pound, and the tobacco farmer couldn't make any money. Now, in those days, you had the banking trust, the steel mill trust, the oil trust, you had all the trusts. So all the rich guys kept their money hidden from the public, and they also paid very, very low wages to workers who would work. And so there was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 made monopolies illegal, and they're still illegal today. So what they did is they gathered together about 10,000 farmers, merchants, the sheriff, the judge, and got a vigilante group called the Night Riders. And there was 10,000 of them strong. This is about 1902. But the Tobacco Wars encompassed 650,000 people were involved in this war. So it was not a little thing. It was big. And so the Night Riders would go out and find out who was selling to the trust, and they would pull them out of their homes, horsewhip them, burn down their tobacco barns, or run their horses through the tobacco field, and said, "You will not sell to the trust. It's a secret organization." And so that's what the big war was about. Then as Teddy Roosevelt comes along, and he's a trust buster, and he got rid of all the trusts with the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court on, I think it was December 11th, 1911, John D. Rockefeller was brought in, and they broke up his monopoly of the oil trust, made him sell off. He broke it up into about 6 or 8 different companies. Then instead of having Standard Oil, you had Exxon, and you had Mobil, Texaco, and all those companies. But he no longer had a monopoly. Then that same day, they brought in James Duke, or Buck Duke. They busted up the tobacco trust and turned that into about 6 or 8 separate companies also. And those two guys made more money broken up than they ever would have done by themselves. So then the rich guys, Rockefeller, Duke, and several others, they go down to Jekyll Island, and what do they come up with? 1913, they come up with the Fed and the IRS, and that's how big government started. Now they have money because they're taxing the folks. So this goes on and on and on. And so you fast forward into, say, the mid-50s when Eisenhower was in office, and the deep state was pretty well entrenched by that time. So then come up to present day, and we've had monopolies now working for the past 30, 40 years. They'd be like the Google, Facebook. Those guys are monopolists, and what they did is the same thing as what the guys did 120 years ago. They would buy out their competition. Their competition would come in with a great ideal, and they would give them so much money for their company that they couldn't turn it down. So then these companies have 50 to 100 separate companies that they control, and they have become monopolists again. And so the end of the thing hasn't happened yet, but Donald Trump, I view him like Teddy Roosevelt. So I see Donald Trump busting up the monopolies with the help of the Fed and the IRS. And they're already under investigation. So that's kind of where it starts and where it ended. So when we wrote the book, by one great-grandfather, his name was George Washington Kinney. He was a tobacco buyer, buying tobacco from farmers who didn't have barns, would process it, hire them back to process it for market. And he was the one that would be a target for the night riders. Then my other great-grandfather, George Washington Jett, he was a night rider. So one day when my grandparents were young kids, Mr. Jett came up to Mr. Kinney's house with a band of night riders, brought him out of the house, horsewhipped him real bad, and burned down all our tobacco barns. And so my family is part of it on both sides.
Oh
That kind of gives you a brief outline of what it was like.
Oh my gosh. That's amazing. Well, I got a little bit of an education years ago. I got transferred to a district office in Louisville, Kentucky, when I worked for a Fortune 500 chemical company. And we ended up buying this beautiful Victorian house in Henry County. And the house came with tobacco poundage. And I looked at the house, and it had an acre, but I looked at that and went, there is no way anybody has farmed anything on this tiny acre in who knows how long. I don't know what this tobacco poundage is. I don't know anything about it. And the real estate agent that we used, her husband was the broker. And he came to me and he says, well, I know you all don't want to grow your tobacco. I'll buy that poundage from you. And I thought to myself, no, wait a minute. If it's that valuable that he's asking me for it the day after we've closed on the house and we haven't even moved our furniture in yet, I better do a little research and find out what we're talking about.
Yep, you're a smart girl because it's worth a lot of money.
So the entire time we lived there, so I ended up saying, thanks, but no thanks, because his offer was, I felt, kind of lowball. And he took it real well. He was still real friendly. And then we got a local farmer who had plenty of acres and plenty of experience, and he knew which end of the tobacco plant was which. We leased him the pounds. And so every year he would pay to lease, and then he would go out and grow, and whatever money he made between what he paid us and what they paid him, that was his profit, and paid for all of his expenses and stuff. And the whole time we lived there, I never raised the rate of what the lease was per pound, because I felt like, well, the market fluctuates and it's just additional income to me. And I felt like, well, he's doing all the work, so I'll just give him a little leg up. If time goes on and the price increases, then he makes a little bit better margin. So we never increased the lease price the whole time. But
so how much money did you get off your acre of tobacco?
Over the years that we lived there, I think we lived in that house.
Just 1 year.
Oh my God, I don't even remember now.
Yeah.
But
Well,
we
it was
had
very
like
profitable.
1,800 pounds. It was,
1,800 pounds.
yeah, it
Wow.
was a halfway decent amount for an acre's worth of
1,800.
property, you know.
That'd be four or $5,000
Yeah, I mean, we didn't
total.
do too bad, you know.
Yeah, paid the taxes.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah. Oh yeah.
and then some.
Yeah, I paid
Well,
the
then you
taxes
did.
and
So you didn't have the pleasure of raising tobacco, did you? He did all the work.
he did all the work.
Yeah.
He made the profit margin, but he all that sweat equity in it, I don't know if he actually made a profit or not. When I finally learned what it took to raise tobacco, I'm not sure how much profit they're really making over there.
Well, as my grandfather said, if you've not raised a crop of tobacco, you've never worked a day in your life.
I could see that. At one point,
Yeah.
after the district office in Louisville closed and I owned my own business, I had a lady that worked for me, and she and her husband raised tobacco. And she would always say, okay, now I'm going to go home and we're going to do 8 to 12 hours of this, that, or the other thing. And she'd already worked a 10-hour day for me. Um,
Hmm.
and she'd come in the next day, fingers bloodied and just exhausted. And I'd be like, oh my God, you know, and every day she'd say, you want to come help? I'd be like, no, thanks. I like my fingers exactly the way they are. It's hard work.
Well, when I was 10 or 11 years old, my grandfather set me up with his neighbor, and they had 1/10 of an acre of tobacco. And so he said, let the boy uh, share, raise the crop of tobacco this year. So I did. And then when it came time to sell it, which is around Thanksgiving time or sometime in that area, you
Yeah.
go to the warehouse and sell it. That 1/10 of an acre brought $300, of which I
Oh,
got $150. But this
wow.
was in the early 1950s, and $300 would buy you a very nice used car.
Absolutely.
Um, and
Well,
so
three
that's back
grand
when I was
would have
going.
bought you a brand new one, so 300 wouldn't be half bad money.
All $1,700 would buy you a brand new one.
Oh,
And
okay.
so um, jeans were selling for $1.79. So I bought my school clothes, and I was pretty happy.
I guess so. Wow.
But then as you're working the tobacco patch, you get all kinds of stories from the old folks who worked at the tobacco patch, and they talked about the night riders. But we always had that scrapbook in our house. Now we lived in a log cabin courthouse that was built back in the 1740s, 1780s by the French, who came in to Kentucky and Tennessee and built courthouses in the counties in those two states. It
Mm-hmm.
used to be the old Virginia territory, and so the scrapbook gave us a lot of good information. We pulled the scrapbooks out of under the couch when I was 6, 7, 8, 9 years old and read about the horse whippings, the barn burnings, the warehouse burnings, that type of thing. So it was a
Oh,
big event.
it
It's
was. It
been
was.
buried.
It was
It's been buried.
huge. A lot of people in Kentucky know about it, but the rest of them don't. What fascinated me in the book was how um, the tycoons, the robber barons, whatever you want to call them, because when you're using the word trust, that's equivalent to what we call now as like a privately held corporation. Is that about the same thing?
Well, the trust basically is a monopoly, and
Right.
the trust held the money.
Okay.
Then today it's monopolies. The
Right. So
monopolies
it's the
are
big
Google,
businesses.
Facebook, and all those guys.
Yeah, the big,
So
big
that's what it is.
businesses that own all of the little businesses that feed into them. Um, but what fascinated
And
me